Well, good evening, everyone, and happy Archives Month. Welcome to tonight's program, Memory's Journey, Addressing Difficult Family History. We have three fantastic panelists to help close out our 2022 celebration of Archives Month in Virginia, celebrating its 20th year. I'm sure that we will have an engaging and informative discussion tonight, and we hope that some of you will join in during the Q&A session. Before I introduce our speakers, a word about Archives Month. Every October, the Virginia Caucus of the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference, or MARAC, organizes events, activities, and programs to help raise awareness about the importance of archives to our society. From strengthening collective memory to providing essential support for accountability and transparency, archives serve a critical role. Archival materials help protect our rights by documenting citizenship or military service, our property by establishing chain of title or transfers, and our identities as citizens through birth and immigration documents. Archivists play a key role in not only the preservation of the past, but also in ensuring that records created today will be accessible in the future. Archival description is one method used to increase collection accessibility. To that end, I would like to share news about an updated resource. Archival Resources of the Virginias, or ARVIS, the interface formerly known as Virginia Heritage, is a consolidated database which provides information about a vast array of manuscripts and archival materials housed in historical societies, libraries, museums, colleges, and universities across Virginia and West Virginia. Researchers can search across thousands of collection guides, and new and updated finding aids are added daily. Information about ARVIS is available in the lobby or from your friendly neighborhood archivist. But on to tonight's panel. We're honored to have with us Mallory Noe-Payne, Richmond Bureau Chief for Radio IQ and the 2020-2021 recipient of the Fulbright Young Journalist Award, and co-host along with RTD reporter Michael Paul Williams of the podcast Memory Wars, which explores how Germany has and has not confronted its difficult history and posits whether America might do the same. Karice Luck-Brimmer, Community Initiatives Program Associate for Virginia Humanities, responsible for regional engagement in Southern Virginia and supporting the General Assembly African American Cultural Resources Task Force. She is also the founding president of the Danville, Pittsylvania County chapter of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, or AUGS, and a member of the Virginia Board of Historic Resources. And Timothy Kilby, author of Gourdvine Black and White, who has devoted countless hours to researching his family history. Originally from Sperryville in Rappahannock County, before retiring in 2014, he had careers in education, art, and information technology. Let's welcome all of our speakers. So I hope for this to be kind of a relaxed conversation as we've discussed, and we'll get some audience participation in a bit. But I wanted to start off kind of posing the question of what prompted you to explore your family history? Mallory, we'll start off with you.
Okay, I'm so happy to be here tonight. So as Vince said in my introduction, I made a podcast. I'm a radio reporter here in Richmond. I cover state politics and policy, and I got this fantastic opportunity to go abroad to Germany for a year. And I spent that time researching and learning about how German society has confronted its terrible history, the history of the Holocaust and of Nazism. And part of that process was having some really difficult conversations with folks whose grandparents, parents were perpetrators of that violence and were victims of that violence. And I was having these difficult conversations with people who had spent a lot of time learning about their family history and who had gone to really great lengths to learn about their family history. And I had an editor say to me, well, Mallory, we're doing this project, you're having these conversations, and the entire point of the project is to kind of ask this big question about whether there are any lessons for America. And you're from Virginia. Your family is from the American South. What do you know about your own family history? And I was like, nothing really. And my co-host, Michael Paul Williams, and our editor, Ola Wakimi, both kind of looked at me and they were like, "You're not curious?" And I was like, "No, not really." And they poked and they prodded. And after I returned home to Germany, and I had spent some time, returned home to Richmond from Germany, and I had spent some time reflecting, I was like, well, maybe it's time to go down that rabbit hole. And I did. And it's one of the episodes of the podcast, which is called Memory Wars. And it took me here to the Library of Virginia, and to Vince right there, who helped me, shout out to Archive Month, who helped me do some research and do some digging right here in this building and learn about my family history. And that's what got me started. You know, I kind of think of myself as a novice. That was earlier this year. I'm not a huge history buff or genealogy buff. It was part of this project. And it literally took one day. It took one day to find an enslaver, to find a Confederate soldier. That's how I got started. Next up.
Karice, can you tell us how you got started with an interest in family history?
Yes, it all started with my grandfather, Reverend Bedford Luck, who was a community historian. And he always talked about his great-grandfather, Gardner Luck, who was enslaved. And he would keep me engaged with his animations and detailed stories of his childhood. And, you know, the more I think about it, you know, he knew that I would not get these stories outside of our home because these things weren't taught in school, you know. So I've been on this journey of discovery since I was a teenager, collecting the oral histories in the neighborhood I grew up in, only to find out that my ancestors were enslaved in that same community. So it really changed my life. Genealogy changed my life. And shout out to Camp Grove, the neighborhood that I grew up in. And that is the same neighborhood that Gardner Luck was enslaved in.
Tim, how did you get on your discovery of genealogy?
Well, perhaps not like Mallory. I was a curious kid. I was curious right from my young adulthood. And, you know, I had looked at the phone book back in my small village of Sperryville and saw these names that had my same surname, Kilby. And I had asked one of my parents, I guess it was my dad, I said, who are these? Are they part of our family? And the response, as I recall, was, no, we're not kin to them. You know, I don't know who they are, or you know, we don't know who those folks are. And I had questions, of course, about, you know, who were these folks that had the same surname that I had? Well, it really started me on a road when in 1980, someone came knocking at my door. And at my home, a Black woman appeared and said, you know, I'm doing some genealogy in the neighborhood and I think we're kin to each other. That was the start, I think, of me really wanting to know about what was deep into my heart, that and my conscience, that I thought there's far more to the Kilby story that I should know about, that is not being told, that I should know. And my curiosity said, you really need to feed this passion you have for genealogy and for family history and to do some research and try to find out and fit the pieces of the puzzle together and find out the answers that have been troubling you for so long. So we'll be telling you more about that later, but that's the beginning of where I started.
Well, Mallory, since you're just in this early stage, have you been sharing this information with other family? And what's been sort of the reaction in your larger family with this discovery? Did folks already know this information in your family or in extended family, or how has it been received?
So my parents are here tonight. It feels weird to sort of speak for them, but it was news to them, to my close family. This was something that that we didn't know. There were bits and pieces of the history that matched up with what I had known. I learned that I had a German immigrant ancestor who immigrated here shortly before the Civil War, and then as a young man enlisted in the Confederate Army here in Richmond. And I knew that I had a German immigrant ancestor, and there were pieces of his story I did know, but I did not know that he had enlisted in the Confederate Army. Right, that memory had not trickled down, while other pieces had. The ancestor that claimed ownership over human beings in Spotsylvania, we didn't know that at all. So there were pieces of the family history that weren't remembered, that were purposefully forgotten. In terms of reaction, I've done something interesting in that I've made a podcast about it. So I have reactions from friends, and I've had conversations with friends that I wouldn't have had otherwise. I've had friends come to me and be like, oh, for instance, a friend came to me and say, I know, and my mother has talked about how we have ancestors that enslaved more than 100 people. And it's like, well, why haven't we talked about this before? That seems like a big deal, right? That seems like something really important. And it's sparked conversation that I wouldn't have otherwise had. And then the final sort of reaction that I've gotten from listeners sometimes is people trying to be nice and trying to say to me, don't feel bad. And I don't like that reaction. It makes me uncomfortable, right? I'm not trying to make excuses or qualify anything, and I don't want you to either. And that's the range of experiences. I haven't had conversations with wider family outside of my immediate family.
Karice, it sounds like in your connection to genealogy, there was really a concerted effort to ensure that these stories from your family were passed on precisely because there was a fear that they weren't documented elsewhere. Perhaps we've lost Karice.
Yes.
Oh. Uh-oh. No one's ever experienced this in the last 3 years, right? Well, I'm not sure what we'll do, but we'll move along. I'm really sorry to have lost Karice there, but Tim, in your work is obviously much farther along. You've published a book. You've really sussed out a lot of history about since that knock on the door. There we go, hooray! And I'll jump back to Karice after this. We lost you for a second, Karice, but we're going to get right back to you. But Tim, what has been your experience with sort of this conversation within your own family as you've discovered more about the connections between the Black and White Kilbys?
Well, I have the distinction, I guess, not particularly wanting that distinction of being the oldest generation in my family, a member of that generation. I have a few cousins, white cousins, and I've really lost communications with many of my family for decades now, and so I've not had those kinds of hard discussions with that part of my immediate family, either about the history that I've uncovered. I suspect that those would be very difficult kinds of conversations if I did have them. I do have one first cousin who she has taken the lead in making contact with our black side of the family, our Black cousins, and in fact written a book about that. And so she and I have lots of discussions about what is that history? We share that history. What is the legacy that our ancestors left to us? How do we process that knowledge that we have now? And we have those discussions with our Black cousins as well, of which I've met many, and that conversation is for me right now, it's a much more comfortable conversation, and it's with a wider audience because I have, as I say, made contact with dozens of the descendants of those that were enslaved by my ancestors. So those conversations, although they are difficult kinds of conversations, and the history, it's a difficult history to contemplate for both sides of the family, but we do that trusting that we're being honest with each other in our feelings and our real desire to try to work through those things to hopefully come to a place where there's some degree of reconciliation. So I don't know what the reaction is going to be from that wider Kilby family. Perhaps silence is an answer in itself, but time will tell. And I'm open to having those kinds of conversations with anyone and everyone that would like to engage in this history.
Karice, I before we lost you there, I was curious to know kind of a little bit in opposition to Mallory's experience. Like there was really an effort on the part of your family to keep these stories alive, precisely because they weren't necessarily documented elsewhere other than oral tradition or personal materials. So can you talk a little bit about that? And even though this is perhaps difficult history for your family, there is a real desire to keep it alive and share it from generation to generation.
Yes, I think it's important, when doing this work that we center the voices of the community, the descendant community, those with lived experiences and narratives passed down from their ancestors. And we can't always do this with an academic approach. Oftentimes we watch our history being told through the eyes of someone who has no connection to the community that they're talking about, and I just feel like we have to tell our own stories, because it's not that we own that history, but that is our history. Our people need to know that our history matters and it's worth telling. My interaction with the descendants of the slave owners has been a little different because oftentimes my experience with them is between myself and white genealogists who are doing this work, and they're making discoveries every day. And they're having to reckon with the knowledge of having an ancestor who enslaved people. I've had, at conferences, people come up to me crying, asking me, how do I, reckon with this history? They just don't want to believe that their ancestor was this brutal, slave owner, so they're embarrassed. And for that reason, they're unwilling to share. But this information, it will help other African-American genealogists with their research, because we know within, the white families, with Black families, we didn't appear by name until the 1870 census. They don't have that experiences. They have, family histories, family Bibles, things that have been recorded since the beginning of time, so they know. And there's a sense of pride that comes from just knowing who you are and knowing where you come from, and so, it's just different experiences, it can be, difficult. But I think, the thing that we can start with, and this is not so difficult, is just being open to sharing. This is 2022. This isn't, 1865. Why can't we share and be open and, willing to, just, it's one of those things I will just never understand. I know with, the African-American family, with the traumas and things that have been passed down, but I feel like if, we're trying to progress and we're trying to move past these things, why can't we talk about it? Why are you embarrassed? Why are you ashamed? Own that history.
Can I say something really quickly? Because I want to speak to what Karice just said, right? She said that within her community and her family, there was a sense of ownership of the history. This is our history. I think that white Americans need to feel the same way, right? We need to accept our sense of responsibility for the fact that this is our history. And we need to own that in the same way and pass it down in our families in the same way. That's what I want to add. I think it just speaks directly to what Karice was saying. What she was saying resonated with me, because we need it too. But, you don't necessarily get to feel pride about it. You do feel shame about it. And that's okay. I think that's a really important step. Something that I learned in my research and work in Germany is that in many ways, shame is a first step of processing that can lead to and end in responsibility. And so it takes owning that history in the same way that I hear Karice describing her community owning the history.
And that's an interesting segue into talking about work with descendant communities. In a sense, Tim, you're working with descendant communities, with the cousins that you've connected with through your research. And Karice, you have worked with not only your own, but specifically, I'm thinking about the Miller family at Sharswood Plantation in Gretna, and uncovering that history. For those of you who aren't familiar, Sharswood Plantation in Gretna, Virginia, was purchased by a member of the Miller family, and he discovered that his family was enslaved on the property that he bought. And Karice was one of the researchers who helped peel back some of that history. So one of the things I was interested in that conversation that was shared in the Washington Post article was the kind of generational differences that played into, it seemed like some of the younger generation were willing to do exactly what you're saying, engage in this and experience it. But perhaps there was a reticence on the part of an older generation who were a little bit closer to the trauma of it. Can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, that generational gap has been a hindrance in some ways in uncovering our family's history, because some families just don't want to talk about the ills of slavery around the dinner table. And there are reasons for that. You know, when you inherit generations of trauma that has been passed down from your ancestors, not only from slavery, but the aftermath of slavery, from Reconstruction to Jim Crow, blocking out the past is the way you cope. So in my own family history and the civil rights movement were hotbeds of discussion around my dinner table. So that played a part in how open and intentional, you know, I was about helping others uncover their family history, because it was accepted. But that is one of the issues, you know, is the generational gap, because like you said, they are so close to that trauma. And so our youth, you know, this generation, they just surprise me all the time. You know, they want to know. They don't care about the politics behind it. You know, they're just on this journey of discovery. They want to know who they are and where they come from.
Tim, you, in our conversations prior to, you had talked about you know, this engagement with your cousins as and you alluded to it earlier in your comments about sort of through these, and to Mallory's point, through these difficult conversations become sort of enriching relationships and connections. Can you speak a little bit more to that experience?
Well, yes. I mean, you know, I've experienced that generational, somewhat reticence to engage in these conversations as well. But we all recognize that this is a shared history, that it's part of the white family's history, it's part of the Black family's history. And we enter our conversation with that mutual respect. It has really amazed me at times, but comforted me when someone of the Black family, the Black cousins, have told me, you know, it was so important for the information that you've shared because it does let me know who I am. And that question of who am I think is important no matter what the generation is. That's a heartwarming moment when someone can tell you that, you know, the information that you've uncovered lets me know who my great-great-grandmother or my great-great-great-grandmother was and what she went through during life. And it has relevance to my life, and it helps me understand a lot about who I am and what my life has been and what my life is going to be.
I think one of the sort of lines that come up, and I don't, Mallory, if you've experienced this in any of your conversations, you kind of got a little bit alluded to, but Tim, in your book's conclusion, you talk about the idea of presentism and this idea that, like, well, we can't judge the past by today's standards. You can't feel bad about this stuff. You know, it's that kind of arm's length that you were talking about. You know, I bear no responsibility, but you reject this idea that our ancestors were simply adrift on this sea of contemporary mores and had no sort of inherent, you know, idea of right and wrong. In turn, could you all go, maybe starting with Mallory, about this, just this idea, and maybe pull in your Germany experience about this idea of, like, well, that that was a long time ago, or that wasn't me. I didn't personally do anything. How have you experienced that kind of line of thinking?
Something that you hear about the Holocaust is never forget. Right? It's inherent, and no one questions the importance of that. And I realized that in what I was doing by saying, you know, I don't need to know the specifics of my own family history. I was saying I'm fine with forgetting. When I dug into the past and when I learned the specifics, when I learned that I had an ancestor named Pearson Payne in Spotsylvania who claimed ownership over 6 human beings, including 3 young children, that knowledge mattered. Those specifics mattered. How long ago it was didn't matter. I can't tell other individuals how to process that for themselves, but I can say that it is worth knowing. And depending on who you are, it may not be hard to find out. So if you're reluctant, it's worth interrogating why. And that can be a really important first step.
Karice, how do you address this idea that, you know, history is a long time ago, it doesn't have any relevance to today or affect anyone today? We lost her again.
Well, we forget. So it is irrelevant, and I said it's all about progression, moving forward, and I feel like we have an obligation to humanity, white and Black people, to reckon with this history. It's just, there's a way.
Let's try it again. We'll give her a minute. Tim, how do you address that idea that this is the past? Let it be in the past.
Oh gosh, this has always been a real difficulty for me to try to explain the family history in terms that would be honest about what the ancestors might have thought about an issue and how I think about that in current days. Genealogists have a little saying that goes like this. They say, your ancestors lived in a different time and they lived in a different place. They're really not referring to a different geographic place. They're talking about they lived in a different place where they had different value systems, they had different opinions about things, they had different attitudes, they lived under different laws. So as I'm doing this research, I have to know about that period of time when they lived, about that time when they enslaved other human beings, about how they may have thought about that situation and about the social norms of the time, what their sense of morality was. Now, as I'm thinking about that, I think to myself, aren't there some levels of morality that are really go beyond periods of time, that go back so far that we can then say that our ancestors were doing something that we now judge as to be wrong and to be harmful to other human beings. But they probably thought that way too. How could their conscience allow them to do things that perhaps were troubling for them? How could they do things? How could I use my own sense of what is right and wrong now to understand what the ancestors were doing to people? I see that they were doing grave harm to other human beings. They did not consider the people that they were enslaving as being human beings. And I want to try to understand, how could they think this way? Now, the historians, the professional historians, the academia historians would tell me that I am falling into a grave trap of presentism, that I am judging the past based upon my current sense of right and wrong. And if that's the case, I will say guilty. I'm doing that. Let me give you one example. I know that for a white member of my Kilby family, he was an overseer on the family plantation, the small plantation, and the oral history, which is, I believe, is very reliable, came down that he violently whipped a number of the slaves that were on that plantation. His daughter and his granddaughter presented that story. So I have reason to believe that. Is it right for me to call his actions sadistic? That's probably a professional historian would say, no, you should not say that. He also abused a female enslaved person. He fathered children by her. I write that he sexually abused, that he sexually assaulted that person. In my sense of things, I call that rape. And in modern terms, we use those terms as well. But historians might shake their finger at me and say, you should reflect what the times were, what the laws were, which gave that overseer and that enslaver full legal right to do as they wished. But there was a moral hierarchy here in play that I feel that we should tell the truth about the situation. We should tell the truth about those ancestors and make that information part of that family history.
Karice, before we lost you for a second there, we were talking about this idea of not judging the past by the present. Can you speak to that?
Yes, before I got disconnected, I was just going to say that, your ancestors are my ancestors. Like in the case of the Kilby family, I appreciate what he said when he spoke to the fact of them being raped. Because so often we try to romanticize these things, even in the case of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. We try to romanticize and, in some cases act like it was this big love affair when it was, rape. My own experiences for every enslaver that I have found, that enslaved my family, I am related to them. So they're not only your great-great-grandpa, they're my great-great-grandpa too. So what do we do with that? What do we do with that part of it? They may be your ancestors, but they're my ancestors too. Just the feelings around it, you had, just to think about, because they were considered property, that you can do what you want to do at will, and have, your own children walking around on the plantation and you're not acknowledging them, they're only your property. And that's something we have to acknowledge as well. We're all related somehow, especially in the United States, So when you talk about them being your ancestors, they're our ancestors too.
And here's the difference. Karice speaks about generational trauma in the Black community. You know what the white community has? Generational wealth. So, we have the same ancestors, but we get something very different out of that experience.
They didn't pass down the same things.
They didn't pass down the same things to each of us. And that's what makes the past not so far past. All you have to do is look at the racial disparities that exist today in America with health outcomes, educational outcomes, wealth building, to know that it's not in the past still.
Well, that's an excellent, it's almost like we worked this out. That was an excellent transition to my next sort of talking point of how can this difficult knowledge that we've talked about this evening be turned into positive action? And in large and small ways, how have you all personally done this? Tim, do you want to start with that?
Well, the first thing that came to my mind when you asked that question is the R word, reparations. That's not something that our family is afraid to talk about at all. We understand our the cousin that I'm engaged with, the white cousin that I'm engaged with. We understand that our family did in fact gain from over generations, gain from enslaving other human beings. We recognize that there was a gradual generational wealth gain there. We recognize that is our responsibility to do something to make amends for our ancestors. I personally don't feel that I don't carry a lot of guilt. I do carry a lot of shame of my ancestors. And I also feel a lot of personal responsibility, not only to my family, but to all Blacks, because I know that slavery, the legacy of slavery has made, half of our society, has impoverished half of our society, or has reduced the opportunities for half of our society. So I feel a great deal of personal responsibility in that respect. So in our family, we do take steps, multiple forms of reparation. It's not just monetary reparations, but it's something as simple as acknowledging this history, acknowledging the fact and wanting to work together to try to reconcile, to make the world a better place for both of our families.
Karice, what's a way that you can point to that this knowledge kind of has been turned, aside from the things that you've already talked about, into positive action? What do we, beyond just acknowledging it and perhaps having conversations, what are other steps that this difficult information can lead us to? Well, maybe we'll skip to Mallory and see if we can get Karice. Oh, we lost her again.
Pattern.
Yeah. Mallory, and maybe even allude to, some of what you experienced over in Germany is how folks are taking difficult knowledge, and not to just dwell on slavery. The exhibit outside shows there's a lot of history that is sometimes difficult to deal with, and not just the history of enslavement, but but the Holocaust and other things, like how are people taking what is difficult to know and turning it into something more positive?
I mean, Germany has the largest financial reparation systems ever. They paid out cash payments to Holocaust survivors and their descendants. Property was restored. There was a program in the 90s that when real estate transactions had to be cleared, and they looked into the history of property, and if it had been stolen from a Jewish family, then they had to put in an effort to find those people and restore it to them. So I'm hopeful that by sharing my story and by encouraging others to do the same in terms of learning their own history, I think, and I'm hopeful that with concrete knowledge comes a keener sense of how that history has impacted us all today and helps shift the needle of political opinion on what can be done to repair the harm today. I can't tell people, once again, like I said, how to process or even how to act. But I do sort of encourage people to reflect on what is it that you could learn about your ancestors that would make you feel proud? What is it that you could learn about your ancestors that would make you feel ashamed? And what is it that you want your descendants to learn about? And questions like that can help guide your actions today.
Karice, how do you feel that we can turn some of this knowledge and acknowledgement into positive action?
Well, one thing about, this history is that, in doing the research, you kind of uncovering the stories, you learn all types of things about your ancestors and how they contributed to where you live. You learned like who the architects were and, who did this and who did, these things. One of the things that I have been doing in the city is providing cultural heritage tours. And I infuse a lot of genealogy with that. And what has happened as a result of those cultural tours is that people are taking them, white and Black, and they have no idea of what happened where they live. They have no idea of this history. So it's opened a lot of eyes, and it also has affected economic development and the city. A lot of this history, a lot of our neighborhoods are historic, as well. And, slavery isn't the only thing, slavery isn't our only history. And so even with these, like I was saying, our neighborhoods are historic too. And so the ways that we've been able to affect the community in positive ways with this information is by sharing, because people are able to take this information and apply for historic markers, all types of things, So there's a lot of positiveness that comes out of, doing this. Like I said, I infuse a lot of genealogy with this. And I'll tell, if I have time, this one quick story about this one house that I go by, the Williams House, which is now our NAACP house. But the house was built in 1906 by Robert Allen for his family. And this Robert Allen was a master craftsman and brick mason. But his father, Robert Allen Sr., born about 1835, this man was enslaved by a Julius Allen, who was in fact his father. This has been well documented through DNA evidence. The white and Black families know about this. And he never took a white wife, but he had a slave woman named Betsy that lived in the house with him, and he had 12 children by her. So in August 1862, he leaves a will. And, you know, he gives his other slaves. We all know that slavery is familial and the slaves are passed down through the family. So he just gives them to various family members. But for his children and Betsy, he leaves them to his nephew-in-law, William Patton. Patton Street in Danville is named after him, for a period of 7 years. And after the 7 years, he was supposed to take them to a free state, give them $3,000 and let them go free. So Emancipation Proclamation happens, and he feels like he doesn't need to uphold his end of the bargain. And so this Robert Allen, you know, during this era of Reconstruction, you know, he had enough guts to take this man to court, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. You can even Google this case. This is the case of Allen versus Patton. But this is, you know, these are the stories that we uncover when we do genealogy, and we use these stories and we turn them into the positive, you know, because people can use these stories, you know, to, I mean, in the case of economic development, you know, with their communities and with the marker program and all of these things. So it all goes hand in hand. So that's one of the ways that's been positive, you know, for me, just, you know, getting it out there, because more and more people are interested in, you know, what I do. And they're like, okay, we want to know. We want to know. So that's where I've been with it.
And that engagement is a positive that comes out of this, is as you all have alluded to, just having the discussions is a positive move and sort of moves the needle in a lot of areas. Before we get too far along, I wanted to open up the floor to questions from the audience. We have a little bit of time left. And if I could ask my helpers to get the microphones for folks so that they can be heard on the, you got to yank really hard there. Yeah. And so any questions from the audience? Anyone have any remarks or questions or? Oh,
my name is Susan White, and I'm here with a friend who is was enslaved. An ancestor of hers was enslaved by an ancestor of mine. We've done a lot of work on learning the man's story. What I would say about doing something, how you can do something positive, it's taken a long time for me to resolve or to sort of chew on my family's history. But what I've finally come down to is that I can help other people learn about their families. I have a knack for research. It's something I really like. You know, I'm on my own journey for reparation, and I'm not a wealthy person. I can't endow a scholarship or anything like that, but I can try to make my own way and make some sense of where I come from. And I think that's been spoken about here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for your work too.
I might want your help. I also really want to acknowledge that what we're talking about and what so many people are engaging in is this individual system of like of repair over generations. And there's something very, I don't know quite the right word for it, incredible that the two of you have found your way to one another. And the same goes for you and your cousins, right? But for instance, in my case, I need help because there are no names on the documents that I found. I don't know where to go with that. I can't trace, I have not yet been able to trace individuals to individuals. And the bottom line is that if we want repair now, we shouldn't need to rely on individuals to trace to individuals. That's not realistic. The sin was an individual sin, but it was also a societal sin. And so a repair needs to be systemic and societal. I think that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, it's easy to say, we were too poor to enslave people, or, there was some sort of excuse for you not to investigate that, and it isn't necessarily that you have to come from someone who enslaved anyone. Your ancestors may have still benefited from the system, or the other, systems of oppression that were existing at the time on a lot of levels, some of which are reflected out in the exhibit cases out there. Are there any other questions or comments or ideas?
My name is Elizabeth Anderson, and what happens when you have an ancestor that did something really, really bad, and that there's an entire organization here in Richmond to remember this? It's the Marshall Street Well Project, if anybody knows that. Mm-hmm. I participated in the community building, but truly the ancestors were the ones that were, and I wasn't sure what I could do or what I could say. And I feel like there's so much to just be a representative of my ancestor and to feel the shame in public. But I really just don't know how to do that. And when I went to the event that they had early on years ago, I was the only white person there. And I learned a lot. I do feel like when they were talking about the boxes to put the body parts in for remembrance, and they said, we were going to get them made in Africa. And I was like, why wouldn't you get them made here in America by African Americans? And they said, well, these weren't African Americans, they were Africans. And that, these turns, as I continue to look at my family history and lineage, I want to do so much more than I feel like I have the capabilities of doing. And coming to this tonight was absolutely fascinating, and to hear all of your points of view. And I will make mention of, I did learn also that I'm related by blood to Sally Hemings, because Sally Hemings and Martha Jefferson were sisters. And I've participated, there's a plantation in Chesterfield County that has once a year, the day that they open, and but I would love to find that connection with my Black cousins, but I also feel like because of that, that maybe they wouldn't be interested in me. I don't know, but this is a really good conversation to have, and I'm so happy that you all were here to give us your thoughts.
The Marshall Street Well Project, somebody who knows more than me can correct me if I'm wrong. I only know the broad strokes, but for those of you who don't know, VCU Medical School, before it's VCU Medical School. No, am I wrong? Mm-hmm. MCV, thank you. Okay. The history that you're alluding to is MCV's history of using Africans from medical experiments for advancing medical knowledge, and discarding those bodies. And then building over top of the site, right, where bodies were thrown into a well. Do I have it wrong? Yeah.
HELOC, HELOC, is that connected to HELOC by using body parts and blood for testing?
For,
Connected to the same thing?
no,
It's
no, Henrietta Lacks. No,
Um,
that's a
it's
different.
time period, but it's
Yeah.
connected in the sense that it's the exact same thing going on,
Right,
which is
right.
using Black bodies.
Right.
Yeah. Mhm.
There was a period where we did a blog about it here at the library, but there were a lot of times the medical students with the kind of tacit approval of the administration they got cadavers to work on by robbing graves, and a lot of times those were Black graveyards that were robbed. And then in addition, the state instituted a system documented here in the library's records of after a certain point, any unclaimed bodies from the penitentiary or the mental institutions that were unclaimed by the family could be sent to the medical colleges for anatomical research. So again, these are largely and disproportionately Black and brown bodies that are being worked on. These and I would just say, as I'm not new to Richmond anymore, but I've been here 23 years, but I was not here when that was discovered. But a bunch of us from the library here, walked down when the remains were brought back to Richmond and just attended that procession. And I'm not saying this is the only thing to do, but I think being there and acknowledging that felt important to me. To recognize that there weren't just Black and brown faces there, that there were, white faces there, to acknowledge that. And I think participating in gatherings and things, I know the Marshall Street Well folks are they have a group and they're active in acknowledging that history. And I think just being present and learning from that process is a good step. And there may be other opportunities that evolve out of that. Like as we're talking about here, just engaging can lead to other things. And that is really, I think, a lot of what's come through in what I'm hearing tonight is just to have that engagement. Well, on behalf of the library and the Merrick, Virginia caucus, I would like to thank this evening's speakers for their thoughtful and compelling remarks. I highly encourage everyone to listen again or listen to for the first time the Memory Wars podcast, because it's really excellent and explores a lot of the themes that we've been discussing here tonight. Hopefully we will all leave tonight with a renewed sense of the humanity of all of those who have preceded us and a willingness to approach our shared history with humility, honesty, and genuine curiosity. What we find may not always be pleasant or simple to digest, but as we've heard tonight, it can lead to greater awareness and greater connections in our families, in our communities, and in our society. Thank you all for being here, and thanks so much to our speakers.